Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. is the 46th President of the United States. He is also the 45th person to hold the office. That's a bit weird, but the reason for it is this magnificently mustachioed mofo called Grover Cleveland. Aside from being from a time when it was okay for humans to have Muppet names, Cleveland did something that no other president had done before or since. He occupied the Oval Office twice, non-consecutively. That means he was the 22nd man to be elected president, but he was both the 22nd and 24th presidents of the United States. Thanks to this quirk of history, the two numbers will always be off. Cleveland was president 120 years ago, and the circumstances surrounding his effect on the numbering are well documented. Now imagine it's 2,300 years later and nobody can find a complete copy of the original records. How much of a chance do you think you'd stand correctly ordering and numbering things? In a previous video, the video previous to this one if you're watching in order, I talked about the Egyptian historian priest Manetho and his seeming invention of an entire dynasty. How did that happen? Was there a 7th dynasty? And why would classical Egypt's foremost chronologistician, okay, I made that word up, why would Manetho be either mistaken or dishonest about it? There are a couple of things to consider when discussing Manetho's iconic work, Egyptiaca, an almanac produced for a Greek-speaking audience. First, we don't have a copy. There are no complete copies, and even more frustratingly, our access to it is often by proxies. After Manetho's death, the work has been edited, summarized, and translated multiple times by different historians with both Egyptian and non-Egyptian perspectives on history. That makes directly discussing the work difficult. Manetho's dynasties, as discussed in other videos, weren't about family trees as much as they were about phases of leadership. We'll never know for sure, for example, if the so-called first dynasty was a line of fathers and sons, or just the title of king being passed from one king to a general or a brother or what have you. Another issue is in how Manetho named the pharaohs. He was fluent in both Egyptian and Greek, but he was writing in Greek, and he was writing specifically so he could be readable to Greeks. Each language simply makes sounds the other one doesn't. For example, the name that we write as Amenhotep, Manetho wrote as Amenophis. Thutmose became Tuthmosis, sometimes. You see, kings in Egypt had 5 or more names, and Manetho, in an attempt to distinguish the various kings, seemed to pick from this titulary in each case, just to differentiate. But Manetho's sources seemed to be accurate. More accurate than the king lists used as foci of worship in temples, because he mentions pharaohs that do not appear on those lists. He referred to Hatshepsut, or as he called her, Amensis. He refers to Akhenaten, probably by the name Akenkeres, and Tutankhamun by the name Rathos or Rathotis. These pharaohs were elided out of history. An official record of the 18th dynasty shows that Amenhotep III reigned, and then Horemheb reigned, skipping the Artanist pharaohs altogether. Manetho, however, was a priest and would have had access to information not present on monuments and the like. We'll talk about the king list and why some kings were missing another time, but the point is, Manetho did have access to accurate information. He wasn't just wandering around gawping at monuments and guessing. The 7th dynasty, had it existed, would have done so after the end of the period we call the Old Kingdom. It was a time when the power and authority of the kings of Egypt had waned. The Pyramid Age was over, and local warlords either ruled themselves or chose a figurehead to represent their interests. As such, it's easy to imagine conflicting accounts of who was in charge. Couple this with Manetho's inconsistencies in picking which of a pharaoh's 5 names to refer to them as, and you can see how a dynasty might have come into being out of nothing. Let's be clear about one thing. The kings Manetho refers to as part of the 7th dynasty probably did exist. Now, Manetho did do a certain amount of fictionalizing, mostly in the form of what we call syncretizing. Claiming 2 figures are the same figure, the way the Romans made Zeus and Jupiter the same figure. But he generally didn't actually invent anything. The 7th dynasty as a concept was his invention, but the kings who ruled as part of it did indeed rule, though nowadays we tend to think of them as members of the 8th dynasty. It was difficult for Manetho. He didn't have a long string that represented time and find himself with a gap to fill. He wasn't necessarily to know he was overlapping things. Remember that from Manetho's perspective, the so-called 7th dynasty was close to 2,000 years ago. To be honest, it's impressive enough that he had any names at all going back that far. Now, if American presidents hyphenated their surnames with the number of their presidency, 2,000 years from now you might think that Grover Cleveland 22 and Grover Cleveland 24 were separate men. Manetho's 7th dynasty isn't described quite as frantically as it's described in one of the works that follows his. Early Christian historian Sextus Africanus wrote that the dynasty consisted of 70 kings who ruled over 70 days. This obvious exaggeration doesn't strike me as something Africanus legitimately believed, but more as an illustration that he believed it was a time of chaos. Africanus himself was living through a time of turmoil. The European superpower of Rome was beset by threats, foreign and domestic, and he was alive during the year of 5 emperors, so he definitely knew what it was like to live in a society plagued by uncertain leadership. No doubt, to the people who'd lived under the absolute rule of a divine monarch during the Old Kingdom, the time immediately following that may well have felt like there was a new king every day. Well, I did it. There's an old myth that the total runtime of every movie and TV show about the Second World War is longer than the war itself. That's not true just yet, but this I know for sure. This video about the 7th dynasty absolutely is longer than the dynasty itself. Thanks for watching. Hopefully I gave you some things to think about regarding history and how it's constructed, and put to bed any idea that Manetho was an incompetent propagandist. If you had a good time, show the like button a good time in return. The 70 pharaohs who rule over my domain are my backers at patreon.com/armchairegypt. Okay, there aren't 70 of them, but wouldn't it be neat if there were? Until next time, my fellow armchair Egyptologists, life, prosperity, and health to you all. Thanks for watching. Head over to my channel for more, or click here to see what the YouTube demons think you should watch next. I hope you'll consider subscribing. If you'd like to support and collaborate on the channel with me, go to patreon.com/armchairegypt. You can also join my Discord community, there's an invite link in the description.